Hello, everyone, and today we have with us Jaime Sunwoo, a multidisciplinary artist from Brooklyn. Many of her works create immersive and sensory experiences that alternate between the humorous and the tragic. She studied art at Yale University and is an alum of the Laundromat Project. Her work has been seen at Jack, Abrams Art Center, Bax, The Tank, Flux Factory, and Art in Odd Places. She was a resident artist for HB Studio Rehearsal Space Residency, and her most recent work, Specially Processed American Me, is part of the Artist Commissioning Program of the Queen's Council on the Arts, where she is an awardee in playwriting. For this work, she has also received awards from the New York City Women's Fund and Asian Women Giving Circle. So thank you so much, Jaime, for joining us today. And let's just jump right into it. Our first question would be, so you are a multidisciplinary artist. So what does that specifically entail?
Yeah, so multidisciplinary just means that, I work in multiple disciplines as I create my work. I actually studied visual art, and I incorporate my visual art practice. So I do a lot of sculpture and painting and video work. I incorporate that with performance and theater. So, and depending on the project, I'll also do, a lot of my projects are research-based. So often I'll do deep dives into different parts of history. And so those are all the disciplines that I've kind of worked in as I create my work, yeah.
And so, as you've mentioned, the numerous disciplines that you're working in, is there a specific medium that you tend to find yourself coming back to over and over again?
Yeah, definitely performance is, I can track through all of it. Often, I am a very visual storyteller. So I will sort of have like, I do kind of mold the design elements of everything I do.
And so, as you mentioned, you work a lot with performance art, and your bio itself states that when you're creating your pieces, you're often looking for the truths between the humorous and the tragic. Mm-hmm. So when you're exploring that space, what do you seem to find over and over again?
Yeah, I think there's something about it where, when something is funny, it's funny because it's true, or people relate to it, like people laugh when they find sort of an uncomfortable truth in something, or if they can relate to whatever you're saying, right? So there's that. And then with tragedy, it's interesting because it's sort of a sobering truth, and it's something that people don't want to talk about usually. Like sad, tragic things are usually hard to talk about. So when you combine humor and tragedy, I think it's a really great way to, find ways to have people relate and find truth in things that are tragic and hard to talk about. So it's kind of, they kind of work together nicely.
It's kind of like, I think of it when you were mentioning of, in The Wizard of Oz, like peeling back the curtain to see kind of what's lying there. Mm-hmm. And so when you're discovering these spaces, how do you tend to showcase them in your art, showcase your findings in your pieces?
Sure. So generally my process is, I'm a very visual storyteller. So sometimes I start with, like, let's say sculptural pieces. And then and those sculptural pieces are often, sometimes you're kind of like more, I have like a feeling that it feels right, and then I go toward, I kind of just move forward on that feeling, and sometimes I'll like research something very heavily and then realize, oh, I really want to make this thing, and then like if it's a performance, I'll kind of build sort of the narrative that I want to share, whether it's linear or not. But pretty much every project is very, very different from one another. Sometimes I do start with the object, sometimes I start with some text. sometimes it all comes together at once, and I kind of can imagine the world and find collaborators that can imagine it with me. So it's all very different. But as far as like how it relates to humor and tragedy, I think I gravitate towards subjects that are hard to talk about normally. But I find like the surreal and sort of like the sort of ridiculousness of certain things that come out of tragedy to be I'm really drawn to that. So that's how I've approached my work.
And so going off of that, when you're talking about, finding that space, I wanted to talk about some of your past work, specifically Earshot and Ear to Ear. I love for both of them the immersive quality in it, I think, and especially reflecting on these pieces today, that idea of connection with people. And so I wanted to, if you could talk about what those projects specifically were and kind of those ideas of connection with the auditory senses, how those work together.
Yeah, sure. So those two projects actually, because not everything I do follows the formula of like what's funny and what's horrible, but yeah, I would say actually the most consistent part of my work is that they're very socially engaged. So normally the audience members that I present to are somehow participating in the work. So there's some sort of engagement and participation in it. And Ear to Ear and Earshot both do that. With Earshot, that's a piece I did right after I graduated college. And I really wanted to create kind of this soundscape where you can enter a real bar in New York City. So the two we worked with, one was called, it was like a sports bar called Kilo Bravo in Williamsburg. And the other one was a nice cocktail bar in the Lower East Side called Bonnie V. And so we worked with both of them. And basically the concept was we would have these portable speakers at each table, and for every character, there would be a portable speaker. So all of the sound was localized. And at every table, we would feature a work by a different playwright for a different, I guess, audio drama playwright. And so we had, I believe, I have to get back to the number because it's been a while, but I think we had 12 tables of conversation. And yeah, we featured, we basically had an open call where it was like, hey, if you want to write an audio play that is set in a bar in New York City, it has to be anywhere, a conversation between 2 to 4 people. And that's pretty much it. Those are the requirements. So we got play submissions, and on the day of the performance, we set everything up so that all the speakers were cued, and so when you walked into the bar, you would hear this crowd noise, but when you sat down at a table, you can kind of eavesdrop into one particular conversation and walk from table to table if you wanted to tune into other plays. But they all the plays were in the same world. So there were some moments that we used to kind of sort of heighten the sense that they were together. So for instance, I gave writers the option to collaborate with one another if they wanted. So a couple of them had moments where their character would get up and move to a different table to, let's say, like pick up a lady or whatever, right? So in those moments, we actually had stagehands who would bring. So in addition to the speakers, we had props for all the characters. So we had like a jacket hanging off your chair, or a purse on the table, a wallet, and you can kind of look through these items to get a sense of who the character is as you're eavesdropping on this conversation. So if a character moved from a table to another table, the stagehand would basically take their props and bring it to another table, and so that like, and to avoid accidentally moving or stealing an actual like guest's belongings, we did have sort of a required coat check. Where you had to leave or if you had a jacket, you would have to keep it on, So like our stagehand wouldn't just run off with your things, but or someone else would like dig through your pockets by accident, right? So yeah, and it was a lot of fun. It was a really hard project because we had those all those different plays. They were all around an hour long, right? So really, you're getting like 12 hours of content, right? That we're kind of smushing into one event because they're all playing simultaneously. And then you need to find voice actors for all of those plays. So it was it's interesting because, during the actual event, you don't see any of the actors. You don't see, everything's pre-recorded, right? But like, it took a long time to produce, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And it was fun. I mean, I think like if I had to do it again, I might approach it a different way. But at the time, I was very happy with it. And for me, even though I had conceived of the soundscape, sort of that environment and how that would be, I still saw myself artistically in that place as a curator, because I was kind of, my job in that role was to really showcase early playwrights, audio plays, right? Work from early playwrights creating audio dramas. There we go. So that's how I saw my role there.
I think what's interesting is that when you were mentioning, moving people like characters from table to table. I'm just trying to think of how you guys got the timing down for that, because that must have been so difficult.
Yeah, so what we did was it was actually surprisingly low tech in that each portable speaker, they were just, we had little MP3s attached to them. Mm-hmm. And we queued it up so that they were all like 10 seconds apart. And so, yeah, and then we created audio files so that it would account for the 10 seconds, or, the next one queued up after that would be 20 seconds or however it is. But basically what would happen is the stagehand would have a stopwatch and just like click play. And then after click play again, and just do that for all of the different MP3s until all of them were synced up. And we built in like silent time, so that basically like we knew exactly when the show was going to start, and we would have a little announcement at the bar where it's like, all right, like it's starting, so like quiet down now, because that's one of the things. Like one of my friends who came to the show said, oh, at first she was listening. She's like, man, people are so rude. They're like talking over all of this, And she looks up and like no one is talking with all the other plays, It's like, oh, okay. She like sat back down and listened to her dialogue. But yeah, that was that project.
Yeah, because I think it's interesting also in terms of, like you said, those types of environments can be loud, but, those moments of like intimacy that can happen like on those tables. And so that kind of segues really well into the other work I want to ask you about, which is called Ear to Ear. And kind of, I saw like the video demonstration you had on your website. And I think the best part of watching it was just watching people's faces just be both inquisitive, but also like very, very like happy. There's a very big moment of happy of just like realizing like kind of the sounds coming through. And so can you talk about what that project specifically was, and kind of once again talking about those ideas of the connections and auditory?
Sure. Yeah. So ear to ear, actually, that activity of just like pressing my face. So I guess I'll go back a little bit and describe what you're talking about. So if you press your ear against someone else's ear, like if this is their head, and you just like press it together so that your ears are touching and are aligned, you can actually hear what's going on in the other person's mouth or throat, you know, if they're swallowing like food or something, as well as you can hear your own sounds. So it's similar to when, let's say, you're eating a cookie and then you kind of close your ears and you can hear the insides, of, you know, kind of the insides of your skull kind of just like crunching away. You'll hear sounds like that from the other person. So it really makes you feel like you're in the other person's body in a way when you're listening. It's just very intimate. And that's because of bone conduction, which basically means like there's vibrations going through your skull. And there's actually some like hearing aids and implants that work the same way, you know? So that's all it is. And that's something that I found out when I was little, because I think I first did that where I just closed my ears and I was chomping away and I was like, whoa, I'm inside my own head for real. And then, you know, every time, like, I was just a really, like, bored kid, right? We didn't, like, especially when I was super little, it's not like I went on a computer and, like, it's not like now where you just stare at an iPad or whatever. So I would go to my siblings or my mom and be like, check this out. And then I wanted to, I kind of tested things out. And then eventually I figured out that I could hear what my mom could hear if I, like, you know, switched my head there. So I kind of forgot about that. And I assumed that everyone knew that, like, I assumed that was just a thing people did. I figured it out. So I remember I took sound art. It was a sound art class at Yale. And one of our first assignments was to, just show any sort of sound piece that we would like for the class. And I didn't really have time to prepare anything. And I also, like, didn't know what to prepare because I didn't really understand what sound art was quite yet. I kind of signed up for the class because I was intrigued, and there was someone from, like, the music department who was collaborating with someone from the art department, and I was like, oh, that's cool. It's interdisciplinary. Like, I'm into that. So I kind of, just as a last minute thing, I was eating lunch and I was like, oh, I'll just do that thing when I was little. And it was pretty much the same exact format. I just had a sign that said, press your ear against my ear and listen. And I had a plate full of food from the cafeteria, and I went to class with it and just sat there when it was my turn. And then, you know, classmates would come up to me and we did it. And then my professor was like, oh, you should keep doing that, you know? Like, that was a good piece. I was like, oh, okay. Like, to me, I was like, oh, this was kind of my, like, last minute thing that I did. And, like, I thought everyone did this, but it turned out, like, no one does this. So yeah, when Art in Odd Places, the open call came about, and they said Art in Odd Places, basically what they do is they take over 14th Street, like Water to Water, every year, and they'll have a different curator. So the one that, so my year, it was all women artists that took over 14th, and I wanted to be able to engage passerby in, like, a very intimate way, and I think it's just very rare for people to connect physically with strangers. I mean, for safety reasons, and also, like, especially, I can't even imagine doing this piece now because of the coronavirus. It would just be impossible. But at the time, it, you know, I think it was the summer, and like, people were just open to doing that. So I ended up actually doing that with around 80 passerby. And I put some of those videos up on Instagram if you look at #ear-to-ear NYC. And I was surprised because what I literally did was I had a little tray with tweezers so that you could be sanitary as you're picking up the items. But I had pretzels, so they're crunchy, and then I had Pop Rocks, so fizzy, and then I had gummy bears, which are chewy, so different textures to listen to. And then I had my sign that said, press your ear onto my ear to listen. And people would just kind of be curious. Like, some people thought maybe I was selling something, or, you know, but I think by the time they walked through 14th and realized a bunch of weird women artists were doing crazy things on the street. I mean, it's art in odd places. So they realized, like, okay, she's probably just another artist who's like doing it. So yeah, I had a lot of people come up to me, and it was like people of all ages, you know, like, and yeah, I think it was just people kind of crave spontaneity and they crave connection, and so that was really nice just to have this little moment. And I really kept even conversations to a minimum. It was like a very pure experience where we just did that kind of like, you know, I would listen to what they were eating, and then we would take turns and they would listen to what I was eating. And it was like a nice little moment. They'd be like, okay, cool, that was great, I had fun, and they would go off on their, you know, wherever they were going.
And so, like you said, you had pop rocks, you had chewy, you had crunchy. Did you have a favorite sound that you heard?
Not necessarily. I think like the experience of the actual experience itself more than the different textures is what makes it unique, of course. So like, I mean, at a more, at the most basic level, it's like, that person is a very thorough chewer. And I would comment, like I'd make a comment, I'd be like, oh, you have like a very thorough, even chew, you know? But no, like it was more of the interactions that I had with people, because some people were like super shy and like kind of self-conscious of, you know, the mouth noises they were making. Like some people, you know, I don't know. It was just really playful, and I think it brought out like, yeah. I mean, people are kind of opening up, you know, to you, and you have no idea who they are, and it's just like it's a really nice moment of connection that's very simple and like has no strings attached, you know. So yeah.
And so, going off of that, I did want to ask about this project that I saw that you were on. It's called Rot. And then also it has a second part, which is when the creature went to NYC.
Right.
Now, this project did come out when the Ebola virus outbreak happened. And so I did want to ask you to kind of talk about that project and kind of some of those messages that you might have been trying to convey with this specific performance. How do you think that kind of relates to today's situation?
Sure. So Rot also started when I was at Yale. I had so the real origin was okay, sorry, I'm trying to think of how to frame this, but I feel like a lot of people, when they take like art classes like you'll see a lot of people take art classes in college, as like kind of a hobby, or, you know, because it's great. I think everyone should do art, but I was one of those weirdos who took science as a hobby. So I was an art major, and I would take like biochem as a hobby. So I had no plans of going into science. I had no plans of, well, going into science is in like, a lot of people kind of were pre-med, you know? Mm-hmm. So there was this one class I took that studied mycology, so the study of like fungi. And they would take you to the Amazon, and you would collect Amazonian plants, and then you would go back to the lab and work for a summer to collect the fungi that were growing off of those plants. So yeah, I really, really wanted to go into that, like be part of that class. And so one of the prerequisites was to go take organic chemistry, which like no one wants to take, but I did it. And I went to the Amazon, I collected my plants, I worked in the lab all summer, and so many of those fungi were so beautiful, because what you would do was you would take a plant and put it on like a plant piece, or the stem, the root, the flower, or wherever, and you would put it on, after you mildly sanitized it under a flame, you would put it on a petri dish with some like potato jelly agar, and you would basically, as you see the fungi and bacteria growing on it, you isolate different parts of the jelly, because different bacteria and different fungi will spread out from different parts of the plate. So you keep isolating until you have like one species of fungi, right? Like, so, you know, from one plant, you'll collect like dozens of different plates until you finally can isolate those colonies. And when you isolated them, like certain fungi are bright, hot pink. Some of them are orange, yellow. You kind of get all the colors of the rainbow. And I was really fascinated by that. I ended up asking my, I guess like there's a postdoc that I worked with there. I asked her like, hey, since I'm an art major, can I like use some of these materials to create sculptures? And you're like, sure. So I was taking a mold making class at the time, and I created like a potato jelly mushroom shape, and I ended up scraping a bunch of the fungi from the, you know, that I collected. None of the Amazonian ones, because like that's kind of, you know, we don't know what that is, but I don't want to like create some sort of invasive species. So it was just all airborne fungi that would grow. And anyway, as I was doing that, I was also thinking about what to do for my senior thesis. And I really want to incorporate fungi into it with all those brilliant colors. And I had this instinct to like perform as this really sort of like restless, reckless thing, like this creature. And I was really inspired by like movies like The Fly and sort of, yeah, like people kind of deteriorating into these monsters. And I think one instinct that I had, it was really because I felt like my art education at Yale, even though it was great, felt very sterile to me. Just like the general nature of contemporary arts today, like white-walled studio, you know, sometimes, you know, people will check in to see what you're up to, but for the most part, like people work in isolation, and like there's a lot of people have like a very formal conceptual approach to teaching fine art, and I felt very claustrophobic to me, and I kind of wanted to just do something very messy. So yeah, I ended up making this like completely rainbow set within the gallery space at Yale. So it was like very stark contrast, this white walls, and then you just have this like, we had this massive 3-wall like structure. And I bought all this like rice and beans. And I ended up like cooking the beans and adding food coloring in. So I just had like rainbow piles of mush. And I had this PSA around the school that, you know, this fungal, like the scientist at the lab, because I was working at the lab, so it's kind of true, but like I had become infected with this unknown fungal disease, and that like, you know, Yale has been keeping it in captivity and quarantining it so that it like doesn't spread to other parts of the school. But if you do want to like kind of witness this creature, then you can, you know, at this time you can see it, kind of thing, you know. And I think I was also like, yeah, interested in movies like King Kong, just sort of like, and then of course there's all these darker histories of, you know, people literally being put on display, like the World's Fair in Queens, right? Mm-hmm. And I thought about that, sort of like, what does it mean to just like gawk at like sort of the weird, or to just gawk at things that you find exotic or strange, or or like freak shows, you know, just like gawking at like people that you think are like outside the norm, or to gawk at suffering, to like tar and feather people. Like I'm really interested in that. So that's what I did. I kind of lured people in, and I would eat this like rainbow bean mush and try to like share it with people in the audience. And then I graduated, and the Dumbo Arts Festival had an open call. And my brother's wife is a doctor, and so he owns a medical clinic called Leaf Medical in Dumbo. And so he was like, "Oh, as long as you have some sort of space in Dumbo where you want to share like work for the festival, you can like submit work, and I'll like submit it with you if you want, because he has that space at Leaf Medical." And I said, "Okay, sure. Like I'll do an art project there." So I ended up taking over that medical clinic. It's closed. It was at the time closed on the weekends. So I put up all of the photos from the Yale performance, and I framed it as a PSA, where it's like, yes, there's this unknown fungal disease that came in from Connecticut, and like it's coming to New York City, but like don't you worry, we've been tracking this infected person, and we're gonna like bring them into the medical clinic so that they can be quarantined and treated. But if you come in contact with a creature, like please let us know so that we can like quarantine and treat you. And it was like very absurd, you know, the medical clinics have these iPads so that when patients wait, they can, you know, their kids can like play with it or whatever, right? So I took over all those iPads and had this like PSA all over them. And that was like the week before. So all week patients would come in and like do that. And my brother was just so nice about it. He let all of that happen. And then since the clinic was closed on the weekends, I collaborated with a few actors. One is sorry, her name's Josephine, and so Josephine's a improv kind of comedian, does a lot of like absurd comedy. So Josephine acted as like the receptionist for the weekend. So people would come in like, I found you on the Dumbo Arts Festival map, and like, am I in the right place? And Josephine was completely in character as the receptionist and would like inform them of this disease, you know? So yeah, I basically started from Grand Central because that's where the creature came in from Connecticut on the train. And I actually, like, these scientists would track me and try to like guide me into this medical clinic. So we went all the way from Grand Central to Times Square, and then we went on the train to Brooklyn Bridge Park, and then walked to the medical clinic. And all along the way, I was like causing a ruckus, right? And so my costume, basically, it's like a full, you don't see my face, it's a full face mask, and there's like glued on uncooked beans and rice, like from head to toe. Even my shoes were covered in it. So it's a full body suit. And then like, because I had some food coloring and certain things, like I was wearing contacts, my contacts turned bright orange. So I had these bright orange eyes, and that was a coincidence because I was like sweating in my suit. And yeah, I looked completely insane, but I stayed in character, and I was just like, you know, like crawling around and like, I don't know. And eventually, yeah, as I was crawling around, the scientists would like give people flyers and like yell at people not to touch me. Mm-hmm. So yeah, finally, when I got to the clinic, we had a performance there, where, you know, they're trying to treat me, but like I'm not really like following their protocol, and I can't sign any forms, and I'm just like, you know, and they're just super bureaucratic. And I noticed that when I was walking around as the creature, a lot of people were screaming Ebola at me. Mm-hmm. And they also screamed Skittles a lot. Because I was rainbow. So Skittles and Ebola. But yeah, I just thought it was interesting because like at the time, you know, people were really hesitant. Well, that's an understatement. Like, people were pretty against the U.S. like providing aid to like people in Africa who were suffering from the Ebola crisis because they didn't want to bring it back. And then the few cases that we've had here, people were freaking out that it would like turn into this kind of pandemic, right? Which is like a valid fear, but I think it was at the expense of people who were like severely suffering out there. And there was this like, yeah, I think people were actually framing the issue in a way that was quite selfish, actually. And I was interested in seeing, like, kind of playing with people's, sort of exposing that people were not being sympathetic to the situation, you know, that like it is something to gawk at almost. That like that pandemic was, well, that disease was something that was sensationalized in a lot of ways, and was very much built on fear over safety. And the other thing I wanted to kind of address was just the fact that sometimes it is just really hard to get treatment because we have like a crazy health system in the U.S. You know, so it was twofold, but it really, I think, overall organically came out at the right time. You know, and you can't really control the way art is perceived because everyone's experience feeds into how they interpret it. And although rot came out of, you know, my experience working in that lab studying fungi, it turned into something else by the time the Ebola crisis hit, you know, and we were mindful of that as we performed it.
And so, as you've mentioned the Ebola crisis that happened and kind of like your thoughts while doing this performance in relation to that. So looking back on that specific performance, do you see any kind of messages that relate to kind of our COVID-19 world today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to stay kind of careful and grounded when it comes to things like this, when people start freaking out and creating their own theories of how things work without any scientific backing, and people are kind of like living in sort of they're coping with fear in an unhealthy way. It's really detrimental to everyone, and yeah, I think that's definitely a theme that I explored for the creature, because it's not like helpful to kind of freak out when there's a pandemic. It's helpful to be careful and to be informed and respond in a way that is recommended by professionals who have the research and know what they're doing, you know. And of course, like, guidelines change all the time because it's a new virus, but it's something that we have to, like, yeah, stay grounded about. Yeah.
All right. And so moving to some things that you are currently working on today. So as I mentioned in your introduction, you are part of the Artist Commissioning Program for Queen's Council in the Arts. So I wanted to ask you specifically, what is that specific program and how did you get involved?
Sure. So the Artist Commissioning Program is relatively new for Queen's Council in the Arts, and basically they had an open call where they were looking for artists that want to create something specific to the Queens community, and they every round they kind of focus on different neighborhoods. So the open call that I had was for Flushing and Nazareth. And so I submitted my project for Flushing. And as long as the project was replicable, so what that means is, like, if I did share my script and the different designs and outlines, like, I can do the performance again somewhere else. and it was relevant to Flushing, like that's all they needed for the application. And so I submitted it, and I was very lucky to get it. So it was me, and I submitted as a playwright. Marcus Yee submitted a musical called Lucky 88, which is about Flushing food courts. And so, yeah, we're representing Flushing. So with that, like, the idea was they wanted to be able to present a new work in Queens, so like a world premiere, because their goal, Queens Council on the Arts, their goal is to make Queens like a strong hub for the arts, and having a world premiere where you're developing a project over time and is a big deal, because that's when like you're open for reviews, and if your show tours, like the first world premiere will always be in Queens, right? It's like a part of the project's history. So yeah, that was the idea. And my project, especially Processed American Me, I thought was really fitting for the Flushing community, because it explores it's autobiographical, first of all. So it tracks how my parents immigrated from South Korea to New York. It tracks their immigration story, and then how that's kind of shaped my identity. So it's a very New York-centric story. And of course, there's a large Korean population in Flushing. And also, the story looks at how spam has influenced the Asia Pacific region. So we have cast members that all grew up eating spam, and a big part of it is to kind of share the shared histories within the Asian diaspora. So we have stories from Hawaii and Guam, the Philippines, Japan, Okinawa, and we in Korea. So I kind of thought that Flushing would be a great place to highlight all of these stories, because again, like, the Asian community is very strong in Queens. Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to continuing to work with them. I mean, right now we're planning a ACP live event. So what that would entail is we were giving a little teaser of all the different works that Queens Council on the Arts commissioned. I'll be sharing a few video clips from past work in progress performances of my work, because I actually have been working on this project since for a while now, like for like 2.5 years. So I have some footage. So I'll be sharing scenes that take place during the Korean War. And then we're also going to feature a community partner. So right now it's going to be Korean American Family Service Center. And so the virtual event, the donations will be split between QCA and Korean American Family Service Center. And then after, we're going to have a panel where Sejin Park, the moderator, who also works for the Noguchi Museum, will, and is one of the art commissioners at QCA, will moderate a conversation with questions that are inspired by the scenes in my play, as a chance to reflect on the Korean War, because right now it's the 70th anniversary. The Korean War started in 1950, and it really technically hasn't ended yet. So yeah, we thought it would be a unique opportunity to share and reflect. So part of the panel, we're having John Cho, who's also a Flushing commissioner for QCA, and is the executive director of the Flushing Chamber of Commerce, and he works with different Flushing businesses. We have Korean American Story with H.J. Lee. They do like oral history archives for Korean Americans. We have Korean American Family Service Center. We have Professor Hee-Jun Sung, who works at Stony Brook University in Korean Studies. And then we'll have that panel discussion, and kind of track how the Korean War has affected like us personally and also led to the work that we do, and sort of how we see it impacting our constituents that we work with. And then we'll have like a Q&A where we open it up to people in the live chat. But all of it's virtual because, of course, the coronavirus, which leads to also talking about how the world premiere, which is supposed to be like a fully staged production, is not going to be possible this year, because I think the rollout for coronavirus, like lifting coronavirus restrictions, theaters are going to be last for that. We're not quite ready for that. So instead, we're going to do a virtual table read. It'll be a virtual reading, and we'll have all the actors do like a live reading of it and be able to get some feedback afterward.
And hopefully, as things get better, the world premiere will be soon. Keeping fingers crossed.
Sure. No. So, I mean, I definitely do want to do the show in 2021, if possible. And I think like all of the granting organizations that have agreed to support the project all have been very flexible about that, because they understand that just theater all over the country is at a standstill right now.
And so, as you were mentioning, for yourself, your project is helping to represent the Flushing community. So I wanted to ask, do you have personal connections in Flushing yourself as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, of course, I'm working with those panelists and with QCA, but at a personal level, I mean, I was born in Brooklyn. My family, the neighborhood I grew up in Gravesend, actually didn't have a lot of other Korean families. So whenever we wanted to go to like a wedding or celebrate a big birthday, or if we wanted to go to the sauna, we would go to Flushing, you know? I mean, there's Manhattan Koreatown too. And I went there a lot because my mom's fashion company was in Herald Square for many, many years. But Flushing was still the best place to just like gather lots of people for, like a toll, for instance, when a baby's first birthday, that kind of thing. Celebrations we would always do in like catering halls in Flushing. And I also like going to public schools. I went to LaGuardia High School too. So a lot of my friends came from all over the city. They would like commute in, and I definitely like had plenty of opportunities to hang out in Flushing. So for me, it really represents like kind of like a safe haven for Korean Americans. You know, you can just kind of like get lost and do your own thing there. And I definitely feel like it's a home for Korean Americans in New York City for sure.
And so going off of that, you know, that kind of overlaps with my next question, which is about like, you know, this artist commissioning program. It's about democratizing that art commissioning process so that local communities like Flushing can have these big world premieres of art shows and things like that. So what does that specifically mean to you in terms of democratizing that art commissioning process?
Well, QCA's model is really unique because the people that commission the work are the community members that the work's being commissioned for, which is in contrast to a lot of these organizations that are kind of more gatekeeping and maybe don't come from the community, but want to create more like and diversify their portfolios, which is important as well. But I think what's unique to this is it's really, there's a more intimate understanding of what the communities want. And their model is also to share untold stories specifically. So I think like they do a great job of democratizing the art process and commissioning process in that they're really getting input from local Flushing community members, and they also do like monthly check-ins with everyone. I mean, because of the coronavirus, it's all been virtual, but you know, in previous years, they were able to, like the model was supposed to be that all the different commissioners, because they work for different organizations within Flushing, every time we would meet at their location, like at their workplace. So the first one we did was at the Noguchi Museum with Sejin Park, who's an education coordinator there. And we got a tour of the space, and then had our meeting there, which was really nice. And I wish we could have continued things like that, but of course, like because of the pandemic, we can't. And I do hope to explore all those places more in depth, like once it's kind of, you know, when the restrictions are a little more generous. So, but yeah, I definitely think that they're doing a great job to do that.
And then, so going back to your current piece that is part of that program, so I wanted you to ask if you could elaborate more about SPAM. And so kind of when you were creating this project, why was SPAM the first thing that came into mind when you were creating it, and also how it fuses also into your personal identity as a Korean American?
Sure. So I have been interested in the history of SPAM for a long time, and I think a lot of Asian Americans in general definitely have that fixation as well. And the reason is, you know, unlike all the other products that the American military introduced to people during World War II and the Korean War, like let's say coffee or Hershey's chocolate, you know, any other American imports, SPAM sticks out because it's highly stigmatized in the U.S. So it's known as a poor people food, or like a gross processed meat. It's unhealthy, and it has more of a stigma than, let's say, hot dogs, which are not that different. And so already I was kind of interested in how, like, how is this part of Asian cuisine when it's not an Asian product? Like when it was made in Austin, Minnesota, like I just didn't understand why all my Asian friends ate it, but basically everyone who's non-Asian in the US like detested it. And because it's like this weird secret that you have at home, I think like that's what made me really want to look into how the history of it, like how we started eating it and what that means. Because you know, a lot of my work's focused on food, whether it's like shoving beans and rice on my face and making it rainbow, or like, you know, exploring the history here. Like I wanted to dig deeper in why, like, I had it in fried rice or in this stew called budae-jjigae, which literally means army-based stew in Korean, or why I had it in like rice rolls, kimbap, and things like that. And as I kept digging, I realized, it is because the U.S. military brought it in, and it is like something that people in all of these places, like I mentioned, Guam, Korea, the Philippines, Okinawa, Hawaii, eat it because even after the war, there was a strong U.S. military presence. So there were U.S. bases there, you know, and these are all things that still affect us now. And it really made me wonder, like, I think like SPAM for me was a really great metaphor for the Asian American identity in general, because it's like a very stigmatized food that's deeply American and like entrenched in patriotism because it did fuel the war effort. And then like it's also a very Asian food that's been kind of like reimagined for our palate. And at this point, like I've met some Asian people who genuinely thought SPAM was an Asian product. So yeah, I mean, not people living here, but like I've heard someone from who grew up in Korea who like just didn't know, because actually all of their spam packaging says spam in Korean, and the food conglomerate CJ, they bought the brand and they manufacture their own products in Korea, but it's under the spam, brand. So anyway, that's kind of like doing a deep dive into spam history no one needs to know about. But yeah, it is interesting to see how like food shapes our identity, and how like the identity of a brand, an identity of food, can really like track that history and all those changes.
And so going off of that, we're talking about like history. And so I do want to ask you what your thoughts are, just in general, including spam, that when we talk about food history, how it intertwines with both personal identity and history, but also collective identity and history. And kind of where do you see those similarities happening, but differences happening, especially for instance, where you might maybe have first generation versus second generation. Where does food history kind of intertwine and showcase some similarities, but also differences for them?
Sure. Can I actually take one pause just to get my charger?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, hold on. My laptop's a little old, so I overestimated its battery life. But yeah, sorry. So you were asking basically how our perspectives on food history have changed between the generations. Like
yeah. So like between generations, but also between like personal, like my personal identity, for instance, and then my collective identity, for instance, like with my family, or for myself, I would say like Chinese American. So kind of where those, as an individual, there's so many like Venn diagrams of just who you are and how food history kind of intertwines. So I wanted some of your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think definitely when I guess before I answer, I do want to clarify that my parents are first generation because they moved from Korea to the US, and then I'm second generation, correct? Like, so some people like confuse those terms. So
Okay. Yeah, so like for instance, people who've immigrated here versus people who were born here.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah. Because sometimes I hear people saying like first generation for me, even though like and anyway, but yeah, I just want to clarify how I define it. But I definitely do notice that, for instance, my parents gravitated toward specifically the Korean American community. And people who are second generation like me gravitate towards like Korean Americans for sure, but also see the shared histories and the shared experiences of Asian Americans at large, more than like, let's say my parents do. And that's just a matter of, going to like school here and really growing up here and realizing that no matter what your specific ethnic background is, at the end of the day, people just see you as Asian, right? And as a result, like you become, you are treated, there's a lot of ways that we're treated in many, when we have the same experience, because we're treated the same way by like non-Asian Americans, right? And we also inherit all these myths and all this history that came before us. So even though my parents immigrated in the 70s, we're still affected by all the Asian Americans that came before us, right? So, and all of sort of like the baggage too that comes with that. Um, so yeah, I think like I'm more aware of that because I have more like because I grew up here really. And though they're definitely like aware of that more now, still like their core identity um, it is like more strongly still like very strongly attached to Korea. And the way they raised us too is kind of like um, from the way they were taught to raise children, right? Yeah, and I think that's all really interesting, and especially not just to compare like first generation to second generation, but to compare first generation to people who stayed in Korea, because a lot of, and I think this is true across like all immigrants, where a lot of people notice that um, first generation immigrants here try so hard to preserve their culture and pass it down, and that they're kind of in a time capsule, and they notice that like people in the country that they grew up in are so different now and have become actually more progressive over time. So, my dad would say like, oh, well, in Korea, kids would never do this, or, he has more like conservative gender roles and all these things that were more prevalent when he lived there, right? But like now the country's changing, and people his age that stayed there like are like, no, this is like so 70s, you know what I mean? So yeah, I think that's normal.
Mm-hmm. And so how do you see kind of food history intertwining with that in terms of some of those similarities and differences? I know for myself, sometimes, what was it? Like my parents will make, traditional dishes, and then I'll be like, let's throw something else in there. Like I'll throw macaroni in there, and everyone's just, and then the parents are just like, why are you throwing macaroni in there? Like we should be there. So like kind of like, where do you see kind of food history kind of showcasing kind of those dynamics that you're talking about?
Yeah. I mean, as far as food goes, it's like, the thing is, the US has been in Korea for a long time and has definitely like influenced the culture and food for a long time now. So even a dish like, let's say, budae is a perfect example. The army-based stew dish is literally a combination between American ingredients that soldiers brought in, and Korean ingredients. And so they had like baked beans, American cheese sometimes, Spam for sure, Vienna sausages, and then you had all the Korean ingredients in it. So kimchi, maybe some ramen, rice cake, things like that. And it really came out because Korean people during the war were starving, and all these bases had either excess or, they had Korean people working in their mess halls, and they would take these leftovers that Americans weren't finishing and would kind of just sanitize it in this big boiling stew, this spicy stew. And it because it tasted good, like people just kept making it and eating it, and now you can have it at almost any Korean restaurant will have budae. But yeah, I think like I was already seeing a lot of US influences in Korean cuisine. And I mean, now, like, at home, I might, have, let's say, like, okay, I guess in my personal life, Thanksgiving. The Thanksgiving dinner is probably when I most notice those changes. So, like, we'll try the American dinner with the turkey and the cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, macaroni, but then we'll also need the Korean barbecue meats and like maybe some kimchi stew with all the different banchan side dishes, and we kind of have like a double feast because like the way Korean people celebrate, like we have foods we celebrate with, and like we don't want to just eat turkey, you know. So there's definitely that. Like, yeah, I see it most when we're trying to celebrate like an American holiday, because like, yeah, we just need to combine it. Or you know, my sister-in-law, my brother's wife, is Filipina, so her family's Thanksgiving will be like, yeah, they'll have, well, they don't even like turkey, so instead they'll have luncheon, is this like crispy whole pig. So they'll have that, and then they'll have like all this different Filipino food. So, and I think a lot of immigrant families are just like that. Like they want to do the American traditions, but they also need to celebrate in their own way. You know?
Yeah, no, we always had turkey with lo mein. Turkey with lo mein was always the Thanksgiving combination. And so continuing off of, you know, this idea of meals, so before COVID-19 was happening, obviously, you were hosting like lots of food workshops and, you know, storytelling workshops all over a meal of Spam. So I did want to ask kind of where that idea come out from, and also, you know, how has community's response been so far with that?
Yeah, so those workshops are really fun. I wanted, like, so my theater project is something that I've been developing over time. So the script has been changing, my collaborators have been, you know, changing over time. And I wanted to basically like still engage directly with people, even if I wasn't doing a performance. And the performances too, like, because it's much more in the moment and is like a very surreal autobiographical thing, like even though I have historical references in it and you still learn a lot, I wanted to get a separate chance to really just talk about the history, because it's just so rich, and I thought that like it would be great to hear from like the larger Asian American perspective. And those workshops too have informed the way I wrote my piece and like the collaborators I work with now. So it came very natural for me to do them. I think it's because I have a socially engaged practice, and definitely I see all of those things as part of my artistic practice, that it came naturally. But yeah, so it was twofold. Like I wanted to more directly address the history, and I wanted to have like open conversations about it. And the food, I mean, like people just, they'll come if there's food. So I think if you're doing like talking about food during your entire talk and everyone's doing, like there has to be food. Like people are going to be too hungry. And so what I did was collaborate with different restaurants that serve Spam. The first one I did, I collaborated with actually, it was called Gallery Madison Park. They donated the space for us, and it was, Gallery Madison Park is owned by the same person who owns Ashcan Art Studio, and Ashcan, yeah, they do like portfolio preparation for high school students mostly, or college students that are trying to go to like grad school. So art portfolios. And when I was little, I actually was a student there. So the 원장님, the director of the program, was like, "Oh yeah, you can use my space if you need to. It's close to Koreatown, you know." So I had it there, and I called up 2 Korean restaurants that served the army base stew, and also I think like Spam fried rice. I don't quite remember, but yeah. So I basically had them. I asked for like a food donation, and they gave us a bunch of the army base stew and rice. And then to attendees, I said, if you want to bring a dish from home that has Spam in it, then you can do that too. So people brought over like Spam fried rice and musubi and all of these things that they grew up with. And yeah, it was a really lovely event. And it's free, you know, all of them have been free except for the one at Museum of Food and Drink. That was a ticketed event, and for that we had I collaborated with Junzi Kitchen. Lucas Sin is like a friend of mine, and he made like a spam macaroni soup that was because he grew up in Hong Kong. We had that there. It's like a kind of like a comfort food. It was very good. So he made a batch of that, and then I also worked with a restaurant called Gentle Perch in Williamsburg, and they provided the army base stew. And so, yeah, all of those workshops have basically been like history presentations with community conversation on spam and food. And actually, at those events, I've collected like these handwritten spam reflections. Whether you like it or not, you know, everyone has an opinion. So we've collected over like 100 stories now from all those different events we did, and I'm happy to share some of those with you too.
And so that's amazing in terms of kind of like the community's response for that. And so you had touched on it briefly before where you're talking about with COVID-19 happening, how everything is moving online now. So like, you know, you're showing some of the clips via the stream and the panels and things like that. So I did want to ask, in your opinion, also, how has COVID-19 in general affected the art world? And what does it now mean now that it seems like a lot of work is now being shown as born digital work now?
Yeah. You know, I think like it's definitely difficult because one, I do socially engaged work, so like want to interact with people, and two, theater intrinsically is live and in person. So yeah, I'm basically working in like two sort of practices that are extremely difficult at this time. I mean, the way people have coped with it is definitely by doing virtual events, which I know people get like Zoom fatigue, but I think the more like specific the event is and like organized and sort of pointed it is, people are more willing to come. So I've definitely joined in on some virtual events that have been very engaging, and I haven't felt that burnout at all. But yeah, it is something to navigate. I mean, as I mentioned, the world premiere, I'm not going to be able to do that this year. So we're having that virtual reading. And the panel, I mean, yeah, it's just a shame because like the only thing that is hard to do is really having those organic conversations that, you know, because in a virtual event, you're really taking turns talking, but you don't have those simultaneous conversations like earshot, you know, you don't have the crowd noise. So you do lose a lot from that. And there's something about like also experience something collectively where you feel it in the room, you know. I don't know, like the moment of silence in like a theater when people are just like, oh, you know, or
it's like the vibe.
Yeah, you just don't get that like visceral experience. So there is a loss for sure in performance. And that just means that you have to adapt your work as needed. I mean, I've created a lot more video pieces now, and luckily, like, I have some of those skills because when I was studying art, I took some video art classes. I took the sound art class, and so I have some basic like video editing and sound editing experience. And my collaborators too have been able to work with me virtually. So one of my main collaborators, Matt Chilton, is a musician and has sound equipment at home, and so he's let me like borrow his things and record, and then he's gone off and edited. So there's things that we've done, and my brother's also does a lot of photography, so he let me borrow his lighting equipment and some of his cameras. So I'm lucky in that I have those resources. I mean, even if you just have like an iPhone, you can make something incredible. But the reason why I'm doing all of that is because I was writing a performance piece for Park Avenue Armory, they're doing they were supposed to do an all-day event to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, so the right to vote for women. And because that couldn't happen, they are asking artists to adapt all their works for digital media. And my initial piece, which is also about food history, was looking at the history of the tea trade in parallel to the suffrage movement. And the reason is, like, a lot of suffragists used tea parties as a way to mobilize, and also sold different like charitable tea brands to collect donations for their movement. And yeah, the reason why they chose tea was because it was one of the tea parties were like one of the few ways women could gather in public in like a respectable manner. So men had their coffee houses and restaurants or wherever men go to, but they were like, unless you were accompanied by a man, it was like not really kosher to go there, just like on your own as a woman. So I thought that was interesting that they would have these brands. Like they had one brand called Equality Tea, which was like a charitable brand from the Women's Suffrage Party in California. And then when I just thought that was really interesting because like the tea trade is like so steeped in inequality. And, you know, like the tea trade is what created the opium wars and like fueled colonization and has like a really violent history. And even like, and then I looked even further back in tea history in America, and it's like, you know, we had the Boston Tea Party where, you know, Americans were trying to like, you know, rebel from the British. And like one of the ways they abstained from British imports was to drink what they called Liberty tea. And they used like this Native American red root, this herbal tea, to like kind of claim the land, you know, and be like, yeah, we're like Americans, so we're gonna like drink American tea, and it's gonna be called Liberty tea. But of course, like that is so steeped in irony too, because the Americans are like using this Native American root on land that was basically stolen to like say they're fighting for liberty. And you know, the suffrage movement itself too was like very racially divided. And even when the 19th Amendment was passed, like if you weren't white and like at least middle class, it didn't really do much for you because Asian Americans weren't considered citizens. First of all, like Black women were often like, you know, super like met with a lot of violence at the polls, and there were Jim Crow laws, like, and then there were poll taxes. So if you were poor, you know, you might not be able to vote. And there were literacy tests, you know, like there were all these things to bar basically non-white wealthy women from voting. So yeah, it's been really interesting to translate what was supposed to be a live performance for that into video. But I have a preview actually that I put up on my like Instagram, social media stuff that you can check out. And I'm still working on it. I'm hoping to share it in full for a event at, with the Laundromat Project, who actually like was the one who co-commissioned it with Park Avenue Armory. So yeah, we'll share it then. And I think like Park Avenue Armory for now is just going to have a web archive of all those works instead of doing something in person. But who knows? Like maybe after the pandemic passes, I'm hoping that they can share the works again in person.
Yeah, especially that work sounds really interesting. Because like you said, you know, tea now we just drink it and we're like, you know, it's like fancy. It's like, you know, you go to the tea houses, but there's so much history related to it. Right. And then so going off of that, I also wanted, since that's the project that you're currently working on, but then also personally for you, how has COVID-19 affected your day-to-day life, your routines, and when you have gone outside, kind of what have you been seeing and like changes, especially because now we're in July versus March, kind of what changes you have seen?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I've been in Brooklyn the whole time. The only time I've left was actually last Tuesday. For the very first time, me and my mom and my dad went to Long Island in this like family house that we share out there since like my sister and my brother, they all have kids and they all live in their respective places in Brooklyn. But like we didn't really have a place to like gather everyone for the holidays, for instance. So we have this like family house in Long Island. But yeah, I kind of, because I live alone, and I'm the least like high risk in my family, because my brother's wife's the doctor, and my sister also goes to the office all the time and stuff, and has like kids, and she just has more people in the family while I live alone. Like for the first time, we actually did leave the city for a week in that house. But other than that, like I've just been at my place in Brooklyn. I recently got a bike and that has been really freeing, and I've been able to like visit my mom and just bike like 40 minutes to her, and then biking to my dad takes around 15 minutes. So I've done that, but pretty much, yeah, my life hasn't really changed that much. I'm hesitant to go to restaurants right now, even though I know that a lot of New York City has reopened, just because like the pandemic is still really severe in like the coronavirus. There's still so many cases across the US. And to be honest, like there's no real way to enforce any of these guidelines. Like people say if you're coming in from Florida, for instance, like people are told to self-quarantine for, 2 weeks or whatever, but like there's no one enforcing that. And there are so many people who are just like not wearing masks and like, I don't know. I just feel like a lot of the freedoms that we have in our country are also sometimes to our detriment. So my lifestyle hasn't changed that much for the summer, but I do notice like the weather is nicer and our cases are like, there are less cases in New York. So people are much more like lax about it. I feel like if in my neighborhood, I saw maybe like 85% of people wearing masks. I mean, at the best, like at, even when we were at it, like coronavirus was at its peak. Now I feel like people actually putting on their masks, like in the right way, like with their noses covered too, is maybe at a 50%. I don't think people are really taking it seriously. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like we'll see where it goes, and I'm really hoping we don't have a second wave. But I for now, I'm just going to stay put, mostly just in Brooklyn in my house.
And so, like you're saying, as you were staying put at this time, you are also still engaging with your community still as well. So
Right.
what are ways that, I know you were talking a little bit about the videos that you were making. So kind of like how have you been keeping in contact besides doing like the panels, the live streams? What are other ways that you are daily communicating with your community?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely, yeah, doing those virtual events. I mean, even the virtual table read, I'm doing rehearsals over Zoom. And I think like some of the collaborators in my team are learning how to use OBS, which so that we can like better arrange and our talk. But everything's virtual right now, like absolutely everything. I haven't really. There's no way to rehearse like together. I don't know when that's going to happen, but it's definitely not now. But it does work online right now. Like one of the things that we do before we start rehearsals is just to feel more connected, because it's hard to connect over Zoom, is well, if we have like, let's say 6 people on our Zoom call during rehearsal, we'll pass this ball of energy And we'll say like, okay, I'm going to pass it to Joanne, and then you're going to pass it the ball. So we do that, or at the end we do like a group hug, which just means doing this. I mean, it's sad, but you know, like we're all sharing the same experience. So.
And so, with everything happening and things like that, I did want to ask, I always like to end on a positive note too as well, with like a big group hug.
You can just end the call like this.
Just end the call like that, yeah. But it's kind of just with everything that's been happening, everything you've been seeing, is there anything that you think, where you're most hopeful for to come out of, you know, just everything that is happening?
Yeah. I mean, I think the coronavirus, because, you know, we are forced to kind of slow down and really think about things and reevaluate. I think there are good things that are coming out of it. One thing is like, I think we're reimagining how we can better prepare our society for crises in general, but also like just crisis prevention, you know, and being able to just be more resilient. And I think it's impacting everything, like from, of course, like with Black Lives Matter movement, it's really forcing us to address police brutality and police reform. And I think like it's been able to like, we've been able to focus on those things more because more people are available to protest, or there's no really running away from the problems, you know? Like you can't just say like, like I have no time to think about this because I have so many things at work, or, you know, like a lot of people are really have no excuse to ignore the issue right now. So I think that's really great. Hopefully, I mean, I haven't been on the subway at all, but I'm hoping that it'll be a lot cleaner. So there's that. I think even just in our personal lives, people are taking a step back and like seeing how to like live more balanced lives. Yeah, and I think like once we are able to meet with people, we'll like, I think there's going to be less things we take for granted too, you know? Like, I'm so excited to just, I don't know, the idea of meeting up for someone's like birthday party in a restaurant in Flushing, like going to that catering hall to like celebrate, you know, some, I don't know, like an aunt's 60th birthday or whatever. Like, I would really love that. And I would love to go to all the canceled weddings that we've gone to, you know, like there's like celebrations. And I think like once we can do that, it'll be really like a beautiful moment. Mm-hmm.
And so before we end today's conversation, I do have to ask, where can people find information about you and about Specially Processed American Me?
Sure. So my work, you can just go to jaimesunwoo.com, and I spell my name Jaime, which is not typical, but you'll find me there. And then for Specially Processed American Me, you can go to speciallyprocessed.com. Though if you want to like get more regular updates on the project, you can follow it on social media at everything's at Specially Processed, like on Facebook and Instagram. And you can find me on Facebook and Instagram under like my name as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for speaking with us, Jaime, today, and joining in our What Shapes Our Communities video series. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Joanne.